What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors sits down for what should be a friendly chat about his latest film, only to find himself facing off against a television presenter who seems determined to tear him down? In just 41 seconds, Carol McGiffin would go from respected talk show panelist to being escorted off the Loose Women set, her career hanging by a thread after one shocking outburst that left Pierce Brosnan speechless and viewers across Britain reaching for their remote controls. The ITV studio was buzzing with its usual energy that Tuesday afternoon. The Loose Women set gleamed under the bright television lights. 4 chairs arranged in their familiar semicircle, cameras positioned to capture every angle of what the production team hoped would be another engaging celebrity interview. Pierce Brosnan, dressed impeccably in a navy blue suit, sat comfortably in the guest chair, his famous smile radiating the charm that had made him a household name around the world. Beside him sat the regular panel. Nadia Sawalha fidgeted with her notes, clearly excited about interviewing the former James Bond star. Ruth Langsford smoothed her blonde hair and checked her earpiece one final time. Kay Adams shuffled through her question cards, making sure everything was in perfect order for the live broadcast. And then there was Carol McGiffin, slouched slightly in her chair, with an expression that seemed oddly confrontational for what should have been a pleasant afternoon chat show. The red light flashed on. They were live. Ruth Langsford leaned forward with her warmest television smile. "Welcome back to Loose Women. We're absolutely thrilled to have with us today the incredibly handsome Pierce Brosnan." The studio audience erupted in appreciative applause as Pierce raised his hand in a modest wave, that legendary twinkle in his eye making hearts flutter across living rooms throughout the country. "Pierce, it's wonderful to have you here," Ruth continued, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of a seasoned presenter. "You're here to talk about your new film. But before we get to that, we have to ask about your incredible journey from Ireland to Hollywood stardom." Pierce settled back in his chair, clearly comfortable with this line of questioning. "Well, Ruth, it's been quite the adventure. From my early days in London, working as a street performer, to landing the role of James Bond, I've been incredibly fortunate. The key has always been staying humble and remembering where you come from." Nadia Sawalha practically glowed with enthusiasm. "That's so inspiring, Pierce. You've always struck me as someone who's remained incredibly grounded despite all your success. How do you manage to stay so down to earth?" "I think it comes from my upbringing," Pierce replied thoughtfully. "My mother raised me to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their station in life. Whether you're talking to a studio executive or the person serving you coffee, everyone deserves kindness and courtesy." The conversation was flowing beautifully. Kay Adams jumped in with her next question. "Speaking of respect, Pierce, you've been married to Keely for over 20 years now. In Hollywood, that's practically unheard of. What's the secret to such a lasting relationship?" Pierce's face softened as he spoke about his wife. "Keely is my anchor. She keeps me grounded, keeps me honest. We communicate openly about everything, support each other's dreams, and never take each other for granted. She's not just my wife, she's my best friend and the love of my life." The studio audience collectively sighed at the romantic sentiment, and even the camera operators seemed charmed by his sincerity. Ruth, Nadia, and Kay were clearly enchanted, hanging on his every word. But Carol McGiffin sat in stony silence, her arms crossed, a scowl deepening across her face. "That's absolutely beautiful," Ruth gushed. "You can see why women around the world fell in love with you as James Bond. Speaking of which, do you have a favorite Bond film that you made?" Pierce chuckled warmly. "You know, each one was special in its own way, but if I had to choose, I'd probably say GoldenEye holds a special place in my heart because it was my first. The nerves, the excitement, the pressure of following in the footsteps of Sean Connery and Roger Moore. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The stunts in that film were incredible," Kay added. "Did you do many of them yourself?" "I did what I could," Pierce replied with characteristic modesty. "I wanted to bring authenticity to the role, but I also knew I had to be smart about it. The insurance companies weren't too keen on me doing the really dangerous stuff." The conversation continued pleasantly for several more minutes. Pierce discussed his environmental activism, his passion for painting, his thoughts on the current state of cinema. Throughout it all, he remained gracious, thoughtful, and engaging. The 3 active panelists were clearly enjoying themselves, asking follow-up questions and laughing at his anecdotes. But Carol McGiffin's mood seemed to darken with each passing minute. She checked her watch repeatedly, rolled her eyes during Pierce's responses, and muttered under her breath just loud enough for the other panelists to notice, though not loud enough for the microphones to pick up clearly. Finally, Ruth turned to her colleague. "Carol, you've been awfully quiet. Don't you have any questions for Pierce?" Carol straightened in her chair, and something in her posture immediately put everyone on edge. There was a predatory gleam in her eye, a tension that hadn't been there moments before. The atmosphere in the studio shifted palpably, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "Actually, I do have a question," Carol said, her voice carrying an edge that made Pierce's eyebrows raise slightly in surprise. The other panelists exchanged worried glances, clearly sensing that something was about to go very wrong. Pierce maintained his composure, still smiling politely. "Of course, please go ahead." Carol leaned forward, her voice growing sharper with each word. "I'm curious about something, Pierce. You sit here talking about respect and treating everyone equally, but isn't it true that you've spent your entire career playing characters who treat women as nothing more than objects?" The studio fell silent. Pierce blinked, clearly taken aback by the sudden shift in tone. "I'm sorry, could you clarify what you mean by that?" "Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean," Carol continued, her voice rising slightly. "James Bond, your most famous role, goes through women like tissues. He uses them, discards them, and moves on to the next pretty face. And you played that character for years, glorifying that behavior for impressionable young men around the world." Ruth Langsford shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly wanting to intervene, but unsure how to handle the situation diplomatically. Nadia and Kay looked mortified, their eyes darting between Carol and Pierce as the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Pierce took a deep breath, his professional training kicking in as he tried to address Carol's accusation calmly. "Carol, I understand you might have concerns about some aspects of the Bond character, but I think you're oversimplifying both the role and my approach to playing it. James Bond is a fictional character, and throughout my tenure in the role, I worked with the writers and directors to bring more depth and humanity to him." But Carol wasn't finished. In fact, she was just getting started. Carol's eyes narrowed as she prepared to launch her next verbal assault. The other panelists watched in horror as their colleague transformed before their eyes from a professional broadcaster into something far more sinister and unpredictable. "Oh, please, spare me the artistic integrity speech," Carol snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. "You made millions of pounds portraying a womanizing spy who treats women like garbage, and now you want to sit here and lecture us about respect? That's rich coming from someone who built his fortune on misogyny." Pierce's composure remained remarkably intact, though the other panelists could see his jaw tighten slightly. "Carol, I think you're confusing the actor with the character. I've always been very clear about the distinction between Pierce Brosnan the person and James Bond the fictional spy. In my personal life and in my other roles, I've consistently tried to work with strong, independent women and tell stories that empower rather than diminish them." Ruth Langsford finally found her voice, attempting to steer the conversation back towards safer ground. "Carol, perhaps we should focus on Pierce's new film, which actually features a very strong female lead character." But Carol wasn't about to be redirected. If anything, Ruth's intervention seemed to fuel her anger further. "No, Ruth. I think this is exactly what we should be talking about. Here we have a man who's made a career out of objectifying women, and instead of calling him out on it, we're all sitting here fawning over him like schoolgirls." Nadia Sawalha looked genuinely distressed. "Carol, that's not fair. Pierce has always been respectful in every interview I've seen him in." "Respectful?" Carol's voice rose to a near shout. "He's an actor, Nadia. Of course he's going to put on a nice face for the cameras. But his body of work speaks for itself. How many Bond girls ended up dead after sleeping with him? How many were portrayed as nothing more than eye candy?" Pierce leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining calm but carrying more authority than before. "Carol, I understand you have strong feelings about this, but you're making some very unfair generalizations. The Bond films evolved significantly during my time in the role. We introduced more complex female characters, stronger storylines, and I personally advocated for more respectful treatment of the women in those films." "Respectful treatment?" Carol's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You call having women draped over sports cars and bikinis respectful treatment? You call having them exist solely to service your character's needs respectful?" Kay Adams tried desperately to interject. "Carol, perhaps we should consider that Pierce was working within an established franchise with certain expectations." Carol whirled around to face Kay, her anger now spreading beyond just Pierce. "Oh, so now we're making excuses for him? This is exactly the problem with this industry. Men like him get a free pass because they're charming and handsome, while women are expected to smile and play along with their degrading portrayals. The studio audience had fallen completely silent, the usual murmur of appreciation replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to press down on everyone present. Camera operators exchanged worried glances, unsure whether they should continue filming or cut away. In the production booth, directors frantically discussed whether to go to a commercial break. Pierce took another deep breath, his years of media training serving him well in this increasingly hostile environment. Carol, I respect your passion for women's rights. It's an important cause. But I think you're directing your anger at the wrong target. Throughout my career, I've worked with incredible actresses like Judi Dench, Halle Berry, and Rosamund Pike. These are strong, talented women who brought depth and intelligence to their roles. Oh, how generous of you, Carol shot back, her sarcasm cutting through the air like a blade. You worked with women who were already established stars. How noble. But what about all the young actresses who had to strip down and simper for your character? What about their dignity? Ruth made another attempt to regain control of the situation. Carol, I think we need to remember that Pierce is here as our guest. Our guest? Carol's voice reached a new level of incredulity. He's here to promote his latest film, Ruth. This isn't a social visit. He's using our platform to make money. And I think we have a right to ask him some hard questions about his past choices. Nadia looked on the verge of tears, clearly mortified by her colleague's behavior. But Carol, you're not asking questions. You're making accusations. Carol turned her fury on Nadia next. I'm asking the questions that need to be asked, Nadia. The questions that apparently none of you have the courage to ask. We sit here week after week, fawning over male celebrities, never holding them accountable for the damage their work might do. Pierce's patience, while admirable, was clearly being tested. Carol, I've spent considerable time and money supporting women's charities, advocating for equal pay in Hollywood, and using my platform to highlight women's issues. I'm curious what you've done to advance women's rights beyond criticizing other people's work. The question hit its mark. Carol's face flushed red, and for a moment she seemed genuinely speechless. But rather than backing down, her anger seemed to intensify, reaching dangerous new levels. How dare you, she hissed, her voice low and menacing. How dare you turn this around on me? I've been fighting for women's rights since before you were famous, you arrogant has-been. The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Ruth gasped audibly. Kay's hand flew to her mouth. Nadia looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Even Pierce, with all his experience handling difficult interviews, seemed momentarily stunned by the personal attack. Carol, Ruth said, her voice shaking slightly, that was completely inappropriate. But Carol was beyond caring about appropriateness. Something inside her had snapped, and all the professional restraint that had kept her television career intact for years was crumbling in real time. Inappropriate? Carol laughed bitterly. I'll tell you what's inappropriate, Ruth. What's inappropriate is having this man sit here and lecture us about respect when his most famous character spent decades treating women like disposable toys. What's inappropriate is pretending that entertainment doesn't influence society, that the images we put on screen don't matter. Pierce finally showed a crack in his composure, his voice carrying a slight edge for the first time. Carol, you're entitled to your opinions about the Bond films, but you're not entitled to attack me personally. I've tried to engage with your concerns respectfully, but you seem more interested in grandstanding than having an actual conversation. Grandstanding? Carol's voice reached a fever pitch. I'm the only one here with the guts to tell the truth. The rest of these women are too starstruck to ask the real questions, too worried about being seen as difficult or unfeminine. Kay Adams finally found her courage, her voice trembling with indignation. Carol, that's enough. You're being incredibly disrespectful, not just to Pierce, but to all of us. Carol turned her venom on Kay next. Oh, spare me the righteous indignation, Kay. You're all the same, falling over yourselves to please the famous man while completely ignoring the bigger issues at stake. The situation was spiraling completely out of control. Ruth looked desperately toward the production booth, clearly hoping for guidance on how to handle this unprecedented meltdown. Nadia sat frozen in her chair, tears actually forming in her eyes, as she watched her colleagues self-destruct on live television. Pierce, to his credit, made one final attempt to salvage the situation. Carol, I think we've gotten off track here. Perhaps we could agree to disagree about the Bond films and focus on something more constructive. But Carol McGiffin was far beyond reason now, teetering on the edge of saying something that would end her career forever. Carol's face twisted into an expression of pure malice. her professional mask completely abandoned as she prepared to deliver what would become the most shocking moment in Loose Women history. The studio lights seemed to flicker, as if sensing the approaching catastrophe, casting eerie shadows across the set that made the whole scene feel like something from a nightmare. "Constructive?" Carol spat, rising slightly from her chair as her voice took on a shrill, almost unhinged quality. "You want to know what would be constructive, Pierce? What would be constructive is if aging pretty boys like you would stop pretending to be relevant and just disappear into whatever plastic surgery clinic you crawled out of." The studio audience collectively gasped, a sound like air being sucked out of the room. Ruth's mouth fell open in complete shock. Nadia actually recoiled as if she'd been physically struck. Kay stared at Carol with undisguised horror, unable to believe what she'd just heard come out of her colleague's mouth. Pierce blinked several times, clearly processing the vicious personal attack. For the first time since the interview began, his famous composure cracked completely, replaced by a look of genuine hurt and disbelief. "I'm sorry. What did you just say to me?" But Carol wasn't finished. In fact, the cruel laughter bubbling up from her throat suggested she was just hitting her stride. "Oh, did I hit a nerve? Does the truth hurt, Pierce? You're, 60-something years old? Still trying to play the romantic lead with women young enough to be your daughters. It's pathetic, and frankly quite disturbing when you really think about it." Ruth finally found her voice, though it shook with barely controlled outrage. "Carol McGiffin, that is absolutely unacceptable. You need to apologize immediately." Carol whipped around to face Ruth, her eyes blazing with something that looked dangerously close to madness. "I need to apologize? I need to apologize for telling the truth that none of you have the backbone to speak? This man has made a fortune exploiting women, and now he sits here in his expensive suit, probably fresh from the cosmetic surgeon, expecting us to worship at his feet like every other mindless talk show." Pierce slowly stood up from his chair, his movement deliberate and dignified despite the unprecedented assault on his character. "I think I've heard quite enough. This is completely unprofessional and frankly quite sad to witness." The simple dignity of his response seemed to enrage Carol even further. She shot up from her own chair, her voice reaching decibel levels that made the sound engineers frantically adjust their equipment. "Sad? I'll tell you what's sad. What's sad is a man your age still thinking he's God's gift to women when you're nothing but a washed-up, has been desperately clinging to past glory." Nadia Sawalha finally broke her horrified silence, tears now streaming down her face. "Carol, stop it. Just stop it. This is horrible." But Carol was in full meltdown mode now, spinning around to face Nadia with wild eyes. "Oh, crying now. Are we, Nadia? Typical. Always the victim when someone dares to speak truth to power. Well, I'm not going to sit here and pretend this man deserves our respect when his entire career has been built on the objectification of women." Kay Adams stood up as well, her voice shaking with emotion. "Carol, you've lost your mind. This is not who you are." "This is exactly who I am," Carol shrieked, her voice now so loud it was actually distorting through the microphones. "I'm someone who refuses to play nice with misogynistic has-beens who think they can waltz onto our show and expect us to fawn all over them like teenagers at a boy band concert." Pierce shook his head slowly, his disappointment evident in every line of his face. "I've never experienced anything like this in 30 years of doing interviews. I came here expecting a professional conversation, and instead I've been subjected to a personal attack that has nothing to do with my work or my character." Carol let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Your character? Your character is James Bond, Pierce. A misogynistic dinosaur from a bygone era when women were expected to be grateful for any attention from powerful men. The fact that you can't see how problematic that is just proves how out of touch you really are." Ruth was now standing as well, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Carol, I'm asking you one final time to apologize to our guest and sit down, or I'm going to have to ask you to leave the set." Carol's response was swift and venomous. "Oh, you're going to ask me to leave? Me? I'm the only one here with any integrity, Ruth. I'm the only one willing to hold this man accountable for the damage his career has done to young women's self-esteem and expectations about relationships." Pierce moved toward the edge of the interview area, clearly preparing to leave. "I think it's best if I go. This has become something I don't want to be part of." "Yes, run away," Carol called after him, her voice dripping with contempt. "That's what men like you do when faced with real criticism. You run back to your ivory towers and your yes men who tell you how wonderful you are." That was the final straw for Ruth Langsford. Her professional composure finally shattered completely as she turned on her colleague with undisguised fury. "Carol McGiffin, you are done. "Security, please escort Miss McGiffin from the set immediately." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before their full impact hit home. Carol's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, then disbelief, then rage. "You can't be serious, Ruth. You're going to remove me for telling the truth? I'm removing you for being abusive, unprofessional, and completely out of line." Ruth replied, her voice steady despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "This behavior is unacceptable, and I won't allow it to continue on this program." Two large security guards had appeared at the edge of the set. Clearly, having been summoned during Carol's tirade, they approached carefully, unsure how to handle the delicate situation of removing a regular panelist during a live broadcast. Carol looked around wildly, seeming to finally grasp the gravity of what was happening. "This is ridiculous. I'm being punished for standing up for women's rights. This is exactly the kind of patriarchal nonsense that I was talking about." Pierce had stopped near the studio exit, turning back with a mixture of sadness and dignity. "Carol, I genuinely hope you find whatever peace you're looking for, but this isn't the way to get it." His compassionate response seemed to hit Carol like a physical blow. For just a moment, her mask of rage slipped, revealing something that looked almost like shame underneath. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by renewed defiance. "I don't need your pity, Pierce Brosnan, and I don't need your fake concern. What I needed was for someone in this industry to finally hold you accountable. And if that makes me the villain in your little narrative, then so be it." The security guards had reached her now, speaking in low, respectful tones as they gently encouraged her to come with them. Carol looked around the set one final time, taking in the horrified faces of her colleagues, the stunned silence of the studio audience, and the bewildered expression of the man she had just spent the last several minutes systematically attacking. "This isn't over," she said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier venom. "Someone needs to ask the hard questions, and if it can't be here, then I'll find somewhere else to ask them." Nadia wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her colleague being led away. "Carol, please, just apologize. We can fix this." But Carol shook her head firmly. "I have nothing to apologize for, Nadia. I spoke truth to power, and I do it again." As the security guards escorted Carol toward the studio exit, Ruth turned to Pierce with genuine remorse written across her face. "Pierce, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am. This is not who we are as a program, and it's not representative of our values or our usual standards of professionalism." Pierce nodded graciously, though the strain of the encounter was clearly visible in his eyes. "Ruth, I understand that this wasn't planned, but I think it's best if I leave now. This has been quite enough excitement for one afternoon." Kay stepped forward, her voice thick with emotion. "Pierce, please know that we're all mortified by what just happened. Carol's behavior was completely inexcusable." "I appreciate that, Kay," Pierce replied, straightening his jacket with the same dignity he'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "I hope Carol gets whatever help she needs." As Pierce Brosnan walked off the Loose Women set for what would be the last time, the remaining panelists sat in stunned silence. The studio audience remained completely quiet, unsure how to react to what they had just witnessed. In the production booth, executives frantically worked on damage control strategies, knowing that what had just unfolded would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. Ruth looked directly into the camera, her face a mask of professional composure despite the chaos that had just erupted around her. "We'll be right back after this break, and we sincerely apologize to our viewers for what just occurred." As the show cut to commercial, the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in for everyone involved. In just 41 seconds, Carol McGiffin had gone from respected television presenter to industry pariah, her career effectively ending with a series of attacks so vicious and unprovoked that they would become legendary in the annals of television disasters.